Well, consent education also featured in last night's budget. Fulfilling an election promise, the federal government has pledged $65 million in funding for consent and respectful relationships education in primary and secondary schools. Someone who's been campaigning for this for a long time is Contos. She's the founder of Teach Us Consent and also director of the Australia Institute's Centre for Sex and Gender Equality. She joined us earlier. Contos, welcome to Afternoon Briefing. This is clearly something that you're very proud to see included in the federal budget. Can you talk us through what I think has been a fairly torturous path to get to this stage?
Yes, so the very exciting news is that there is $65 million being allocated towards consent and respectful relationships education over the next 4 years. And what's really led us to this stage has been the voice of thousands of Australians. To be specific, in terms of the Teach Us Consent campaign, 45,000 signed it, and almost 7,000 Australians wrote their testimonies of sexual assault on a public forum for the benefit of the public good, which we are now seeing being tangibly played out with funding.
So when we're talking about what this funding or how this funding should be spent, how do you envisage a sort of education campaign being rolled out? What sort of elements does it need to include?
So from conversations with Prime Minister Albanese and Minister Plibersek earlier this year, this was actually an election promise, which is great to see that being carried through to completion in the budget. And in March on International Women's Day this year, when this was announced, the plan was to assemble an expert panel that can be reference what needs to be done, and they can look into the details of how this should be implemented. And then in addition to that, the allocation of funding is actually hopefully going to be used to incentivize states and territories to also use their own state and territory funding in order to increase the funding in their areas. So, I mean, realistically, if this plan works out, it means that the actual amount of funding being pushed out around the whole of Australia could look more into the 150 million.
So when we're talking about the actual, I guess, the atmosphere that has led to this, you pointed to the campaign that you ran, the shared experiences of so many people across the country. Do you think that we are at a tipping point, might not be the right phrase to use here, but there is now a greater awareness and with that a greater willingness to actually deal with this issue?
I think so. I think a lot of people have had to have really hard conversations, both in the public and private sphere, in order to get to a point where something like a $65 million investment into consent education seems like a good idea to the whole country. And I mean, there was the conversations around sexual assault and consent and the treatment of women and children as a whole dominated media discourse over the last kind of 18 months. And I think this is another testament to that. But I think it's just so promising to see that this is being pushed as a national priority. That's how it was phrased by the ministers who allocated this funding. And that national priority came from all of those conversations, and we've seen, unprecedented levels of investment into reducing violence against women and children. So I hope that it's a first step, and I hope it continues.
You mentioned earlier the idea of getting an expert panel together to devise this sort of program. I guess there are some examples to learn from and maybe avoid from past experiences. The milkshake campaign springs to mind straight up. So what sort of areas do you think need to be the focus as they're developing this program?
I think the focus always has to be in issues that are affecting young people mainly. Of course, it affects everyone, but we're trying to change culture and change generations, and we're focusing on the younger cohort to do that. We need to constantly be engaging experts and youth, and when we find an intersection of that, that's when we're going to see real policy change that helps the people that it needs to.
When we're talking about education campaigns, clearly there's also been running, I guess, parallel with this, a discussion about whether there are not only greater awareness in the community, but legal frameworks and things like that. Is there still work to be done on that side of the equation as well to enshrine things like consent in Australia's legal framework? 100%.
I mean, we've seen affirmative consent laws starting to be dominoed around the nation, which is amazing, but we are one country and we should have uniform laws on sexual assault and consent. And I know that is a priority of our Attorney General, Mark Dreyfus, the federal AG. He has made a commitment to me personally that he will keep that uniform sexual assault laws on the agenda. We also not only need to look into things like affirmative consent, but also concepts such as stealthing, which is the non-consensual removal of a condom, which we're currently trying to get uniformly criminalised around Australia. And the thing with legislation in this space is we know that the legal system is not set up to help survivors or people wanting justice in this space. However, what the legal system can be really powerful in doing is changing community standards and setting what our society accepts. So, for example, the implementation of affirmative consent laws, when an issue is in a courtroom, it is too late. But for the wider population to change the narrative from no means no, which I was taught endless times in my youth, all the way to only yes means yes.
Is there a concern that until that sort of legislative framework is there, that education campaigns going to go so far?
That's a good question. I think we need both. I think we need them concurrently, but I do think for prevention, education campaigns can have a drastically larger impact because, the court system is overrun. It's hard to report these sort of things. It's hard to get convictions for these sort of things. I mean, in Australia, our conviction rate is something like 1.5% or something ridiculous. And when we're looking at it like that, that means that as a country, we've essentially legalised rape. So what we need to do is step back and start educating and changing culture to prevent people entering that system in the first place.
Well, Chanel Contos, this looks like at least a first step towards improving that public knowledge of what this situation means for everyone. So congratulations for some of your lobbying and advocacy in this area, and thanks for joining us on Afternoon Briefing today.
Thank you so much for having me.